Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, where we will be discussing the conflict in Ukraine and the effect it has had on the cybersecurity and sanctions landscape. My name is Casey O'Brien. I'm a director here at SRM in our cybersecurity practice. For those of you not familiar with SRM, we're a global cybersecurity and intelligence consultancy. Now, before moving into cybersecurity, I spent 6 years in our intelligence team where I focused on Russia and the former Soviet Union. So I should theoretically be well placed to facilitate a discussion today that incorporates both the geopolitical elements of what's happening in Ukraine, as well as the implications for the cyber landscape. However, to provide real insights, I'll be leaning heavily on three of my colleagues. First, we have Dan Kaplan. Dan is the head of our incident response practice in the UK. He oversees everything we do from an IR perspective here. Second, we have Martijn Hoekstege. Martijn is the recently appointed head of our new Netherlands office, prior to which he held various senior roles at Northwave, a Dutch cybersecurity company. And last but not least, we have Septimus Knox, deputy head of our disputes and investigations practice. Septimus is a Russian sanctions specialist. For those of you who are early risers and like your satellite news, you may have seen him a few weeks ago on Bloomberg discussing sanctions and their impact on the Russian business community. Welcome to the panel, and again to those of you who are just joining. So, like most of you, I've watched with great sadness as the events of the past 2 months have unfolded. And there are so many elements to the conflict that are worth discussing, not least the humanitarian crises that we're seeing unfold in places like Mariupol and Bucha. However, we do only have an hour today, and I suggest we don't have enough time nor expertise to do all of those topics justice. So we're going to focus on three key areas. First, how has the conflict in Ukraine changed the cyber landscape over the past couple of months? And our team will be sharing their experiences and their observations from working on incident response cases over the last 6-7 weeks or so. Second, how is the information war playing out? So how is information about the conflict being controlled and communicated? Who's doing it well and who's doing it badly? And then finally, we'll move on to talk about sanctions. How are sanctions affecting businesses and how far might they go? I'm going to moderate a discussion between panelists for around 40 minutes, 45 minutes. I think we're going to have a hard stop at 2 o'clock, and then we'll move to questions. Just from a housekeeping perspective, if I could ask you to put your questions in the chat, they'll get sent through to me, and then we'll try and get through as many as we can when we move to the Q&A session about quarter to 2. Okay, I think without further ado, we'll move to our discussion. So the biggest and most difficult question, I think, to answer, how has the conflict in Ukraine changed the cyber landscape over the past 2 months? Martijn, I think as our most recent joiner, it's only fair that I put you on the spot and ask you to tackle that one first. Can you just share your observations through working through IR on the last couple of months on how you think the conflict has impacted the cyber landscape?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. I think in the cyber landscape, most of the incident response cases that we've seen even in the past years have been ransomware groups. There's also some business email compromise in there, but especially the ransomware groups have a very big impact on the companies that they target. And recently, since the Ukraine crisis, we did expect to see a change in the cyber landscape because a lot of these ransomware groups are in Russia or affiliated with Russia. But we didn't really see them tone down their attacks. We've seen a great number of them over the past months. And what has been interesting is these groups have also taken a political stance. We've seen groups that did not just have members in the Russian area, but also in Ukraine. Actually, members in Ukraine, and they were taking a political stance on the conflict. So we've seen them send public messages about either supporting Russia in the conflict or supporting Ukraine, or even calling out companies that support the conflict, asking groups to attack them. They've been very public about the entire conflict, which has been very interesting for us to follow.
So you're saying that we haven't necessarily seen a shift in malicious cyber activity, but we have seen a shift or perhaps a change in attitudes of some of the criminal groups that perpetrate this and drive a lot of the response work that we certainly do. Dan, I'm going to turn to you on that one because I know you've been particularly busy responding to these attacks over the last couple of months. Can you maybe give a bit more insight into what that means, which criminal groups have done what, and what effect that's had on the sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's key. While the activities haven't changed, I think it's the motivations and targets. Historically, or at least over the last couple of years, most ransomware groups out there, those attempting to extort companies for money with their attacks effectively, they've targeted places pretty indiscriminately and industries pretty indiscriminately. Now what we're seeing is a few groups actually changing. They're still doing that, but then they're also actually choosing some targets based on the conflict. So to take a few examples, one of the most prolific ransomware groups out there, known as Conti, announced that they sort of publicly announced on their dedicated dark website that they would retaliate against the critical national infrastructure of organizations or nations who were targeting Russia during the conflict. And that's had quite a few follow-on effects, which I might talk about in a second. But just to kind of give the overview, while Conti's come out obviously in alignment with the Russian government, other groups have done something quite different. One other Russia-based group, so Conti's thought to be based in Russia, but another quite prominent one called Lockbit have came out and stated their neutrality openly to the conflict, likely to avoid international heat effectively. But again, it's not all neutrality or on the side of Russia. A few groups have started actually targeting Russian organizations, which again has been less common in the past by these criminal groups. A lot of activity has come from Russia or around that region and targeted the West, or more Western countries. So things have been changing. One notable example, a group known as NB65 actually reused some leaked source code of Conti's ransomware and then targeted Russian companies with attacks. And in their ransom notes, they are effectively saying that the victims of it should blame Putin for the war crimes he's allegedly committed.
Okay, I'm working through that, and look, even from a cybersecurity perspective, that's quite messy. So if there's any sort of lay people on the call, as it were, that must present quite a few sort of challenges. Say you're targeted by a group like Conti tomorrow. Is the way that you're able to respond to that different to 2 months ago or the start of February before the conflict had begun?
Ultimately, no. So the tactics and the methods they're using are still the same. So a lot of these groups will infiltrate networks, they'll get a foothold, they'll spend some time in it, and then eventually they'll encrypt all your data and systems, leave a note attempting to extort you for cash in exchange for recovering your network. They'll also often steal data these days and threaten to leak it if you don't pay. The same tactics are being used. The way these attacks play out is the same. The only real difference is, as I said previously it was any company was being targeted really, and it was just to gain that cash really for the perpetrators. Now what you're seeing is, if you are a critical national infrastructure provider, say in Belarus, I think the rail system was targeted by one particular group to disrupt the flow of arms in support of the Russian military. If you are in that context, on either side of the conflict now, you've got to consider that you won't just be necessarily part of that wide net these groups are throwing, where they build a long list of targets and then choose the ones they think will be most lucrative. You might be deliberately targeted because you're a political objective, and this is by criminal groups, not necessarily the states themselves.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on that last point because I think that's a really important one, just to take a step back. I think when working in this industry, we're relatively comfortable distinguishing between what's a state actor, what's a state-backed actor, what's a criminal group. Actually, we know that attribution for a lot of malicious cyber attacks is really, really difficult. Martijn, how easy is it at all possible to distinguish between a criminal group, a state-backed group, or a government actor?
It's very difficult. And you see these lines being blurred a lot, especially in the past years. So we know that some criminal groups are heavily affiliated with the Russian government. There have even been criminal groups that we thought for years that were criminal groups, but eventually turned out to just be part of the Russian government. So there were some advanced persistent threats, as we call them. They do large-scale attacks, very advanced, and we thought they were criminally motivated, but they were not. And so these criminal groups that normally have a motive just for money and financial gain suddenly you realize it's not just financial gain. Sometimes they get instructions from the FSB from other parts of the Russian government, and that's also part of their motivation. And you don't necessarily see that in just the technical attack that they're doing. You see that in the way that they communicate, in the reason why they perform these attacks. And actually quite recently, especially for Conti, which Dan already mentioned, they had a member in the Ukraine, part of their criminal group, who of course was not agreeing with their standpoint of siding with Russia, who decided to leak a lot of information, a lot of their internal communication, which to us, it's almost like watching a soap in our cybersecurity field. You see all of their internal communication. It was a big drama, but you could also see that they were also getting instructions from most likely the FSB. They literally mentioned the FSB a couple of times, and that's where lines blur, especially in the international politics right now, which regarding Russia is a lot about sanctions. You have to think about does that mean that this criminal group is also sanctioned? And that does change how you can respond to a ransomware incident, because paying suddenly does not become an option, because it would most likely be a sanctioned transaction.
So I guess it kind of sounds like there's almost a jigsaw here. It's not as straightforward as basically saying, okay, X group used this particular technique, therefore we know it's state backed. What we're doing is relying on lots of different information sources to make an assessment as to how close we think one of these groups might be to the Russian state. I want to just move on a little bit, because I want to talk about actually the Russian government and the Russian state's cyber capabilities. This is a question that we've had a lot from over the past 2 months. What are the motivations of the Russian government from a cyber perspective, and what are their capabilities? I'm pretty sure that if any one of us knew the answer to those questions, we wouldn't be on this webinar. But we saw President Biden a couple of weeks ago warn that there would be an impending cyber attack on the US that we haven't yet seen. If I can ask this, Dan or Martijn, in your informed opinion, if something like that did happen, what might it look like?
I mean, we have to extrapolate from what we've already seen. And what we've seen is Russia attacking Ukraine, also on the cyber front. They have had limited success there. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, they brought down their biggest internet service provider, so they had big disruptions in their internet for around a day. But each and every time, these attacks are basically a one-off. They have infiltrated somewhere and they take it down. The IT team responds, their national emergency response team responds, they get it back up. They now know the way that they've attacked, so they make sure it's safe the next time. So it is almost a comparison to the Second World War, when, of course, the Germans were using a special type of encryption using the Enigma machine. And eventually you crack the Enigma machine. You have to decide, when are you using this information? You can only do it once, because then they know it's cracked and they change their encryptions. Basically, Russia is in this situation. They have a number of different attacks that they can do, or they've also already infiltrated on specific points. But once you use that, once you bring something down, everyone can respond. And so the level of attacks that we've seen in Ukraine, they're very disruptive, but they're not that big. And that they haven't really coordinated with their ground forces. So that's what we were expecting, for them to take down an energy plant and then move into the area to have this combined striking force. But we haven't really seen that being that effective. And just yesterday, a big publication was also done about another type of attack that Russia was trying to do on Ukrainian infrastructure, but it doesn't seem coordinated. And this time they even caught it before they were able to actually do something. So it doesn't look that advanced, but you can never know.
If I could add one quick point, I think it's also that for those not in the know about what cyber capabilities look like in practice, I think it's fair to say any sophisticated, well-organized, well-resourced nation-state cyber group could do a lot of espionage. They could infect networks and disrupt your sort of normal businesses operating environments. But when it comes to things like power grids, even in the publicly proven instances of where it looks like Russia in the past disrupted Ukraine's power grid, they only really took segments of it down for short periods of time. That the possibility of a wide-ranging catastrophic, let's say, power failure out of a cyber attack from Russia, affecting particularly going anywhere beyond Ukraine is probably, I wonder whether you'd agree, Martijn, but probably a little bit unrealistic. And there's a certain amount of spin that's put out there and fear that's propagated by Russia and other Russia in order to kind of make their cyber capabilities look a bit scarier than they really are.
We're going to come back to spin in a second, Dan, and I want to pick up that point when we speak to Septimus. Just closing off this one, though, how well prepared do you think NATO countries are for malicious cyber activity emanating from Russia at the moment? The signs are that they've got pretty good intelligence, both in terms of the ground war and what's happening from a cyber perspective. Do you think that's a reality?
The intelligence is key here. And just what we've seen coming from America just before the conflict started, they were basically predicting every move that Russia was making because their intelligence position was that good. We also know that Russia is very comfortable using criminal groups and steering criminal groups, asking them to attack specific countries, attack specific targets, even get some information specifically. So that's most likely something that they will still do. And that's all the things that we already know. So NATO countries are doing pretty well. I think in terms of just general cyber capabilities, I think it has been a big topic for NATO countries in the past years, but it's always an arms race. And you only know how effective your defense is when you get confronted with an attack. And I think that's also something Russia saw doing their attacks. I think they've been surprised at how good Ukraine has been on the response, not just on the ground, but also in cyber capabilities. Each and every time they were back up online quite quickly. So just from what we've seen now already in the conflict, I think in general we're prepared quite well.
And I guess, so to round off really this first section, because I think I can probably predict some of the questions that are going to come through towards the end. What does this all mean for organizations that are not government affiliated, going about their business, but are at a risk of cyber attack? How is it affecting, let's say, non-government affiliated, they maybe not be critical national infrastructure? Has the kind of risk profile or the threat profile for them changed? And if so, what advice would we give?
So, Dan, you want to
go? I'll add a comment first, and then you can jump in, Martijn. I think a lot of the threats are the same. Ultimately, I think one point Martijn pulled out earlier is really important here, as some of the Russia-based cybercriminal groups, particularly those who have come out in alignment with the Russian government, are no longer. As most of the sort of payment brokers around the world who might help facilitate ransom payments, for example, in normal circumstances, as that's taken off the table due to the sanctions risk associated with them, your options become a bit more limited on recovery if you are targeted by one of those groups. So the quality and security of your backups becomes more important than ever before, because actually you might be targeted by one of those groups, have your data encrypted, and not be able to easily pay a ransom without risking sanctions. So I think that's one change. But beyond that, I think a lot of the threats are the same for non-critical national infrastructure and government businesses. What do you think, Martijn?
I fully agree. The threats are the same. The chance that they will target you, that is increasing.
Yeah.
And this is key here. If you want to protect against Russia attacks, of which no one has an idea of what they are, that's very hard. And the likelihood that they will use their one-off attacks on you if you're not critical infrastructure is just very low, because they're spending ammunition. It's not like they can easily reuse it. the thing that we do know is how these ransomware groups work. We've been doing that for 5 years, and we're tired of it. We know exactly how they work, so you can protect against it. And the time to do that is now, not in a couple of months, because we know that they are on a heightened state of activity now.
Yeah, actually, interestingly, Conti, who you would have thought might have been pushed into the background, with, let's say, some brokers not wanting to deal with them anymore on the payment side of things, and with all the attention focused on them after their chats were leaked, we saw a spike of activity from them last month, and actually maybe even a slight increase in cases coming through from them. So these threats are not going away, and if anything, as Martijn put it, increasing.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Martijn. Septimus, you've been extremely patient so far, so I want to turn to you actually to talk a little bit more about the information war. Now, Dan mentioned the word spin, I think in his previous answer. There is obviously a fight to control information about what's actually happening in Ukraine and communicate that. Who is doing that well, and in your opinion, who's doing that not so well? I think you might be muted, Septimus.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
No problem. We can hear you, yeah.
I think the answer there, when we look at how information is being disseminated in the NATO nations, the Ukrainian government has definitely done an incredibly good job. And I think that's really down to sort of three main factors. The first one is that Zelensky's government understands the 24-hour news cycle and the need to constantly feed it. The second would be that the Zelensky government has used modern technology, be it social media or be it, say, video pools, to really get Ukraine's message out. And you see Zelensky being beamed into parliaments and assembly halls all around the world and addressing leaders all around the world. The third point is that the messaging that the Ukrainian government's been using changes depending on its audience. So when Zelensky addressed Parliament here in the UK, he invoked the language of Churchill. But then when he spoke to the Romanian government, say, he spoke about the Ceausescu era. So the message is very sophisticated and being very well delivered. I mean, if you take a look at the Russian approach, it's a lot more traditional. It's occasionally is relying on quite inconsistent messaging. It's sometimes using what is sort of canned addresses or pre-recorded messages that don't really take into account a very rapidly evolving situation. And then if you look at Russia's attempt, at least in the NATO nations, to sort of spread fear and hype up the capabilities of the Russian military, one of what is fallen very flat. I mean, one of the best examples of this is Ramzan Kadyrov's personal troops, the Kadyrovtsi, who have been dubbed the TikTok battalion, because it's quite obvious they're running around in the background in pristine uniforms, firing at lampposts and traffic lights. So that it did that. Rather than producing fear, it seems to have produced ridicule.
So what we're seeing is actually Ukraine have adapted much better to the kind of changing media landscape, and the Russians are being left behind slightly. I think back to the kind of the annexation of Crimea, and by all accounts the Russian government did a pretty good job of generating domestic support for that ahead of the annexation. You see reports that they didn't quite manage to do that. That didn't quite manage to do that this time. It's also more difficult, I think, for them to control information about what's happening in Ukraine in Russia. What measures are they taking at home to make sure that the Russian population don't have access to accurate information about what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to note that still in Russia, something like 60% of people get their news primarily from the television. So once you ban foreign news or any news organization that doesn't push the Russian government's narrative, then you're left only with state media, and state media can control that narrative fairly well. The government's also introduced 2 new laws that essentially prevent any dissent or criticism or spreading of information contrary to the official narrative, which come with very hefty penalties, so up to 15 years in prison. And then the final thing is that the internet's been choked. So foreign media outlets, foreign social media, so the BBC, Twitter, etc., are very hard to access, and you need a VPN. And now to potentially buy a VPN, you might need it, because there's a sort of a strange dynamic of the sanctions is that you might not be able to do it because your bank card might not work. So it's actually very hard. It's much more difficult than it would have been before. I mean, one of the key areas is Telegram, and information still gets out on there because Telegram's very hard to choke. And I think, going back to what I was saying earlier about the Zelensky government using social media effectively, one of the things they've harnessed very effectively is Telegram. And it's just yesterday we saw the arrest of Viktor Medvedchuk being announced on Telegram, on Zelensky's personal channel.
Can you provide a little bit more information about that arrest, Septimus?
Well, who he is?
No, just in terms of the sequencing of the information, them announcing it.
Well, it was just what was interesting about it is it was it was very, very rapid. So within several hours, seemingly, of what Zelensky, I think what they described as a special operation by the SBU, which is Ukrainian intelligence, within a matter of hours, this image of Medvedchuk was absolutely everywhere. So it's a very effective use of social media.
Yeah, I think the reason I ask is I just think it is quite an interesting juxtaposition. If you've got, I think 60% with the figure waiting for their news on the TV in Russia, whereas on the Ukrainian side, you're getting this stuff instantly, and really harnessing social media to kind of control the information flow. Misinformation has been, kind of topic for the last coming up to 10 years whenever we've been talking about conflict. How has this been different, the spread of misinformation been different with this conflict compared to previous ones? I think back to Russia's military operation in Syria.
Well, I think it's harder to spread misinformation when information writ large is being spread in real time. Mm-hmm. It's quite notable that when you see pictures of even soldiers on the battlefield that tucked behind the magazine on their chest is a smartphone. And every single person is seemingly has access to a smartphone, even ones who are not supposed to, such as soldiers on both sides. And this means two things, I think. Is one, it means that things that have traditionally been very hard to document, such as war crimes, are being documented pretty much in real time. And we've seen that in Bucha, and we've seen that in Mariupol. The other thing is that misinformation that is spread by state actors is easier to counter by just civilians, because they post pictures of, say, a burnt out tank or something and say, look, we've destroyed this tank. And then an army of sort of grassroots activists online geolocate the tank, name exactly what kind of tank it is, and say, this is old, this is actually the other side's tank, etc. So accountability is a lot greater than it's ever been before as a result of just the sort of hose of information that's coming out.
This is the thing. Sorry, Casey, if you wanted to go on. This is the thing, because it's not just a conflict between the military of the Ukraine and the military of Russia. Everyone's involved in this information warfare. Every citizen they can use their smartphone and actually fight this war. And it's not an act of war if you help them do that. So everyone is getting on that. Western media is getting on that, making sure that they validate all this information, putting their rubber stamp on it and saying, this is what we believe to be true. And that's a very, very strong force, I think.
We saw the BBC, and we were discussing this the other day, in the way they are setting out their sources, both official and then corroboration and correlation with social media accounts from the ground.
Yeah, and Dan, the work that we do, very important to verify. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. I'm almost certain it's too simplistic to say everything that comes out of Russia we shouldn't believe, and everything that we come out of Ukraine is believable and accurate. Septimus, I don't know if you could maybe speak about how Ukraine has reported on what's happening there in terms of, we haven't heard too much about Ukrainian casualties compared to Russian military casualties. Do we have to take what comes out of Ukraine, given that we're saying it's actually a well-oiled communications campaign, with a pinch of salt?
Well, if you take the example of, say, battlefield losses specifically, I'm sure many people on this call, use Twitter and have seen that the Kiev Independent, which is like the leading English language publication, publishes every day a list of the Russian losses in Ukraine. Simultaneously, there are sort of groups of OSINT enthusiasts who go through every single picture they can find and document each, say, tank, each weapons system that's been destroyed. And unsurprisingly, those numbers don't match. But that's totally to be expected. But it shows, the Ukrainian government it understands the need to speak to a Western audience, and there are also people who are able to fairly accurately tot up exactly what's happening on the battlefield as a result of the amount of pictures that have been taken.
And what about thinking about it more broadly? I think it's perhaps quite easy when you're in a NATO country with a maybe slightly more developed media landscape, more open media. I think we're probably all better trained at spotting misinformation. What about in non-NATO countries? Has Russia had more success pushing its own narrative there?
Certainly. I mean, if you look at just say the votes in the UN, Russia has clearly been able to win certain nations. If not their support, then definitely their silence. And you can see that by the countries that didn't turn up to vote in the UN resolutions, and the countries that abstained. So that's quite a good yardstick. A notable example of that is probably India, where if you go on Twitter and have a look, there are thousands upon thousands of pro-Russia hashtags from social media accounts in India. And the Indian government was one of the ones that didn't support the recent resolution. So it's quite a good example. Sub-Saharan Africa is another one where you've seen Russian disinformation or misinformation be very successful.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point to consider that from a kind of UK lens, certainly we look at it, it's not quite the picture of Russia that the rest of the world is seeing, and we can't take that for granted. Septimus, I want to move on because I'm conscious of time. I want to talk a little bit about sanctions, which I know is your favourite thing to discuss. We have seen a lot of sanctions introduced, perhaps more than we thought. The sanctions regimes have been much stricter, and they're obviously ever changing. At a high level, how difficult is it for firms to understand their sanctions exposure in the wake of what's happened in Ukraine?
Well, it's extremely difficult, and that's because of two things. I think one is that the situation changes almost every day. So an hour before this call, I think the UK government sanctioned another 206 Russian individuals. So it's moving at such a pace, and it's totally unprecedented in that regard. The other thing is that sanctions lists and databases, etc., do not provide you with the full picture. So you could go onto the OFAC website and plug in a name. That's the Office of Foreign Asset Control, who manages the US sanctions regimes. And you could plug in a name and say, okay, well they're not in the database, therefore it's from a sanctions perspective, you've got the green light. But that's not really how sanctions work. If you take the US example, they have the 50% rule, meaning that any subsidiary of a sanctioned entity that's 50% owned or more is also liable to sanctions. There's also the issue of conferring benefits. So any entity that confers a benefit to a sanctioned entity is also liable to fall foul of sanctions legislation. And finally, there's the issue that's being increasingly you've been seeing in sanctions narratives of, and that's across the EU, UK, and US, is that there is this notion of informal control, which kind of speaks to how, say, oligarchs function, which is oftentimes they don't own a direct stake in an entity or a yacht or a house. It's through an offshore company. It's through a proxy. So the informal control aspect of it attempts to prevent sanction circumvention. And again, no database on the planet is going to tell you that.
So it's a case of this takes active research and investigation as opposed to kind of understanding off the bat by checking against the database. This is really complicated. Obviously, it seems like externally it's a really thorny landscape to pick through. What are these sanctions actually aiming to achieve? And I'm asking you, Septimus, but I open this up to the group as well. What is the purpose of all this?
I mean, I should say I don't have a direct line to any head of state. But reading between the lines, I think there are three objectives. I think the first is to create a very ambiguous and complex regulatory landscape through which any company dealing with or which had dealings with the Russian economy has to now attempt to comprehend. And my personal view is that vagueness that I mentioned earlier is very much deliberate. I think the second aim, which is yet to be seen how successful it will be, is to pressure oligarchs and other key stakeholders in the government to influence essentially Putin and make him change his mind. And then I think the third and more recent development is to hobble the Russian economy and to prevent it from being able to wage war in Ukraine.
Especially that last one is very interesting, because it's just a way, just like the information warfare that we're all actually participating in, believing or not believing something. It's the same thing with the sanctions. Countries can't really send their forces there because that's an act of war. So what else can you do? Well, you can try and ruin their economy. That's not seen as an act of war. So I think everyone's trying to go as far as they can without actually instigating a conflict directly with their country.
I think also people are starting to think about the fact that this war appears to be going on. It's obviously hard to know what people's plans were in advance, really, but it seems to be going on longer than Russia expected. And they've got a massive military operation to support financially. And I think you made some comments the other day to us, Septimus, about Russia's plan to deal with sanctions in terms of the reserves they had in foreign currency being a bit stymied by sanctions on the central bank as well. So the longer this war goes on, and the more that economic sanctions bite, that third objective around making the war difficult to actually fund might be one of the most important ones.
And I want to talk, kind of following on from that, I just want to talk really about the effect of sanctions. So we've talked a little bit about their purpose, both in terms of the impact that it's had on the Russian business community, but also, again, thinking back to the earlier question about incident response, what's the collateral damage? I think it says on the slide there, the ripple effect of sanctions. How are organizations that are not directly affiliated with what's going on here feeling the effect of these sanctions? Septimus, I'm going to ask you first.
Well, I think one of the things that sanctions does, and again, it goes back to the ambiguity point, is that even businesses that don't have anything to do with Russia, or have never had anything to do with Russia, suddenly take the signal from the government that you don't do business there, you don't deal with it. It's a bit like how Iran's reputation of going and doing business in Iran is seen as a risky and edgy thing to do from a sanctions perspective. And that same thing has happened in Russia, probably maybe to a greater extent. So I think the effect sanctions are an instrument of foreign policy, but they create all these unintended consequences, or maybe intended consequences. I don't know. Businesses pull out. There's a definite sort of bifurcation whereby businesses either choose to stay or choose to leave, and the ones who've chosen to stay, I mean, have taken a lot of criticism recently.
Okay, thank you very much, Septimus. We've got a couple of minutes before we move to questions, but before we do, I just want to go around the group and put our panelists on the spot a little. Both from a kind of cyber and sanctions perspective, if the listeners on the webinar today could take away one lesson from this, something that you advise them to do tomorrow before we go to questions, what would that be? I'm going to go with Martijn from a security perspective.
I've already alluded to it before. The time to act and do something is now, is especially when Russia takes its attention away from Ukraine, maybe because they have to stop their entire warfare at some point. I do believe that they will start focusing on the eastern regions of Ukraine, and that might actually go on for a very long time. But they will also take their attentions to the Western countries that have laid very, very heavy sanctions on them, because it has damaged them economically, not in the physical world, but the physical military warfare that's been going on. So they will retaliate, and we know they're going to do that through criminal groups, because that's just a way of whitewashing their attacks. So the time to do something is now, and one of my life missions is to make sure that everyone turns on their two-factor authentication. You don't just log in with your password, you log in with this extra code on your phone. Do it now, do it on all of the accounts that you use for work, but also your private accounts. Who knows? And it's better to do it now. There's a good reason to do it now. There's more attention on it. So if you want to do something tomorrow, at least turn it on for one account. If you want to do something for your organization, get that through, just do it, because it is going to be useful.
That's what we like, Martijn. Actionable advice. Thank you very much. Dan, do you have anything to add there?
Do you know what? I completely agree with what Martijn said. I'll add we have a sort of top 5 on this, but let's cover the top 2. I think, as Martijn said, I think the real threat to most businesses who are not in the firing line of politically motivated attacks is the increased threat from your usual cybercriminal groups. Ransomware is at the top of that list. 2FA, two-factor authentication, will help prevent a lot of those initial footholds. But if it all goes wrong, the thing you need are separate, secured backups that you can restore from. Assume that something might go wrong. Sometimes two-factor authentication is gotten around by criminals who use sophisticated software exploits. Look at your backups, where they are, make sure that they are held separately, secured separately, off your network, not just in a separate geographical site that's connected. And just really review that. If you need expert advice on one thing around your security, get it on that and make sure you're in a good place to restore if the worst happens. The difference between when we come in to respond to incidents where good backups are in place and where they're not is a matter of, maybe it's days to get back or hours to get back to operating versus weeks or even months in the worst case.
Thank you, Dan. And then last word, I guess, goes to Septimus. People on this call terrified about their sanctions exposure. What advice do we give them?
Well, it's that you need to move. The time is now. If you think you're exposed, you need to work out exactly what that exposure is, what it looks like, and how to unwind it. Compliance with sanctions is the responsibility of the business, not the state, to enforce. But if you fall foul of it, the punishments are very severe. So I would recommend, if you think you're exposed, analyze that exposure, understand that exposure, and move to address it as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, Septimus, and thank you to all the panelists. We're going to move to the Q&A now, so if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. We've had a couple come in throughout, so I'll start with those. The first one, apologies in advance, we actually don't have names attached to these questions. How do I evaluate if my organization is at a heightened risk? And this came in when we were talking cyber. Is it just critical infrastructure businesses? I think that's one for either Dan or Martijn.
I'll do the simple one. No, it's not just critical infrastructure.
Okay, and Dan, take the first part.
I think, look, a lot of this. So the question can be broken into 2 parts, right? Are you at heightened risk? I think back to all the themes Martijn and I have been drawing out throughout this. To the usual cyber criminal threats and ransomware, probably yes. There's a slight increase in that happening right now. Even up until now, that's been fairly indiscriminate. It might increase in volume, but still be quite indiscriminate in terms of the industries and places that they're targeted. So, in short, the answer is probably just yes on that front. If you're looking to identify, would you be targeted politically for, specifically targeted by people with more time and resources, you just need to consider, I think, effectively whether any of your business has a direct or indirect impact on governments involved in this conflict's operations. And if you can do that, just look at your degrees of separation and how easy it would be to identify that publicly, and then you can start to think about which actors might find you and might see you as a valuable target. One thing I'd just quickly say on this is that we do often see is the organizations that are one or a couple of steps removed from the government. So let's say a think tank that thinks about defense and has access to high up people in defense ministries. They are often really good targets for politically motivated actors because they often have less security than, let's say, the defense ministry itself. So do think of it in those terms.
Okay, thank you, Dan. There's a question come through. This is a scenario, it's a case study, so you're going to be really tested here. So a question that's come in, what happens if you have a situation where a company has been targeted with a ransomware attack? They don't have backups, they're facing kind of full encryption, but the threat intelligence is insufficient and they can't work out who the threat group is. with the new kind of threat of sanctions hanging over them, what does a company do in that situation? Because typically they might expect the only way to recover is to engage with the threat group. But if they can't say for certain who the threat group is, and there is a risk, a heightened sanctions risk, are they left to just kind of, is there any way that they can respond to that?
Right, there's two things going on here in this question. One is, the assumption is you can not know what threat group it is. If you're in that situation, and you have to make this is a very, very tough situation you're in. You could go to their page or email them and ask them, who are you? And they will give a response. So that's one. Second is, let's say it is an organization that you're not allowed to speak with, do transactions with, whatever. Yeah, your data will be gone. You will have to think about alternative recovery strategies. And it's a very hard thing to do, but I've been on cases where this is just a fact. I've had ransomware groups that say they can do a decryptor, but their encryptor, the program that encrypts all of this data, was actually broken, and all of the data was corrupt. They didn't have backups. Then it is gone, and then you have to go through some grief stage of acceptance, and then figure out how can I move forward with my business. For this business, we're actually able to backtrack a lot of their orders, which would normally be in their order system, because they used to print out the invoices. So they just had to go through all of these invoices and recreate most of the orders, actually call customers saying, okay, we have something going on. We have had a ransomware attack. Please let us know if something is not right with your order. And actually did pretty well. And alternative recovery strategies is the key word here.
Okay, and points to Dan's point before about having good backups. I guess just to kind of take something away, that whenever we do this work, paying a threat actor is the last option. We never want to be in that situation, and I think it's important to make that distinction maybe between engagement with a threat actor to understand more about who they are and what they've done, but stopping short of payment is actually a really important part of understanding, where your kind of sanctions exposure lies with one of these in one of these situations. So it may be that engagement is the best strategy to learn more about the incident, and that in itself is not quite it doesn't carry the same sanctions risk as making a payment would.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you, Martijn. A couple more questions. I'm just looking here. Yeah, so if OFAC is cracking down on sanctions circumvention, are we going to see high net worths, oligarchs using other methods to move their money around, potentially cryptocurrency?
Yes, I'm sure that they will. I'm sure they're heavily invested in trying that.
We saw, and I think there was actually, we didn't talk about this earlier, there was a crypto exchange maybe based in Germany, I think called Hydra, that was shut down. Is that Septimus? I don't know if you can speak to that.
Hydra was the marketplace, Guarantee
that's right.
the exchange.
Okay, and what's happened there?
So they've been sanctioned by OFAC essentially, but that's related to cyber criminality rather than very rich people using cryptocurrency as a sanctions circumvention method. But I think it's interesting that one of the places where lots of these, where lots of very wealthy businessmen have headed post-invasion from Russia is the UAE. The UAE has sort of taken very front-footed about cryptocurrency, and there are lots of crypto exchanges there, etc. And importantly, they haven't sanctioned Russia at all. So I can imagine that if you were looking to circumvent sanctions using cryptocurrency and heading somewhere in the Middle East would probably be quite a good move. But that said, if you try and use the money has to come out at some point, and if it comes out of an exchange that's associated with the US or something, then you could easily end up getting sanctioned. It's not a magic wand by any means.
Okay. We have a question from Matthew, which is, I think, slightly broader and a more sort of geopolitical angle. Russians who basically feel the impact of the sanctions because they are part of the Russian economy, even if they were opposed to the war, they are going to be collateral damage here. Do you think that is going to sow more kind of discontent in Russia and more animosity towards NATO? because people are basically being caught in the sanctions crossfire, as it were?
Well, I mean, obviously sanctions, I mean, the kind of the big criticism always is that there is collateral damage, that, you know, and the other criticism of sanctions is that sanctions alone have never brought down a government, well, not to my knowledge anyway. And they do inflict a huge amount of collateral damage on just regular people. So yeah, there's a possibility that it might affect ordinary people, but also the hope is, I would imagine, by the governments that are using the sanctions, is that it might motivate the man on the street or woman on the street to make moves against the government.
It's an interesting point, Septimus, and I think kind of building on that, there is often maybe I think a misconception in NATO countries about the Russian population more generally, their kind of critical functions around what their government is doing, and I think that, you know, speaking to Russians that I know in Russia at the moment, that there is a lot of kind of division, but it's a complicated issue. It's not just a case of sort of backing your government and therefore by default being anti everything that's happening in NATO countries. Russia is as complex a population as the UK and the US. So, I mean, from my perspective, I have absolutely no doubt that there will be resentment, or at least some resentment to the NATO response when ordinary people's lives are adversely impacted by sanctions. But at the same time, lots of those people, I'm sure, will see why that is perhaps an appropriate or correct response given what is happening in Ukraine. So I do think it is a really, really complex situation, and there are lots of Russians who I sympathize with who have obviously been involuntarily put into this position. I'm just looking through the list. One that's come in. So, have criminal groups been exploiting the narrative of the conflict through phishing or fraud campaigns, which is something that we saw during the pandemic, when people were basically being phished by being sent emails that seem to relate to COVID. Have we seen that here in relation to the conflict in Ukraine?
Yes, Dan, you can take this one. Have you seen it, Dan?
So certainly a number of campaigns, basically fake fundraising campaigns. Which to be fair, has happened in conjunction with pretty much every single humanitarian crisis that has happened across the world in recent memory. What happens is there's lots of legitimate fundraising, of course, and then a number of criminal actors out there produce their own attempt to basically trick unsuspecting and kind-hearted souls into sending money to them instead of the intended recipients. So certainly I've seen some of that. What's not clear, I suppose, what I don't think I know off the top of my head yet is whether the conflict has been used to sort of stage broader attacks, with sort of phishing being the initial entry vector into victims' networks at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a fair amount of that come out online.
Thanks, Dan. An interesting question from Joseph, and I think this is something that the team here have definitely been asked before. It's about Kaspersky, an EDR, so endpoint detection and response solution that's used globally, but based primarily in Russia. Joseph has continually stated that they are focused on providing best protection in the endpoint security space. But if a business is located in one of the locations involved in the conflict, is there a risk in using one of those solutions, and can we trust them?
These questions are almost mostly always revolve around intelligence. So if in your company you have intelligence that might be relevant to Russia, you want to avoid sharing information with any company that's affiliated with the Russian government, because they just might pull some strings and get access that way. And this is always a choice. I mean, so here in the Netherlands, with my perspective on things, we work together with a lot of companies and organizations that are in the US. Because apparently we trust the US more than Russia. But if any of these governments, any of these businesses want to say, oh, now we're rolling out an update to the software, but it has something in there just to get some information out of their network here in the Netherlands, they could. And so the thing is, you can trust them now, but do you also trust them tomorrow or in a month when maybe the Russian government thinks, oh, this is something we can use? Because they're keen to use their pressure and their channels to effectuate attacks like that.
Yeah. Just to add to that, but if you're not, I suppose, if you don't hold information that is likely to now or in the future be relevant to the Russian government, then, you know, Kaspersky, as much as any other product out there, to a certain extent, you know, could do the job for you. You know, I think we've all got to be careful with the current political climate, sort of reaching a position of anything Russian is bad, for example, because it's not really the case. But it is true. But it is true what Martin said about Kaspersky. You know, started in Russia, and the same is true for US security companies and UK ones, I'm sure, as well. If the right tap on the shoulder from the government comes, you've just got to be aware that that's a risk, and then either accept or manage it.
Yeah, I think, you know, at the start of the conflict, we saw these reports of people banning Tolstoy and Dostoevsky as a sort of form of protest against what was happening, which, to that earlier question, I guess is only going to sow more kind of discontent in Russia towards what's happening in NATO countries and our response to that. I think that's all for our questions. Let me check. Yep, that's all. So all that remains is just to say thank you very much, first of all, to our panelists, Martijn, Dan, Septimus. I think there's been a really, really interesting discussion, and appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts. And then thank you to everybody who's joined today, and particularly those who've submitted questions. If there's anything here that's been of interest to you and you'd like to continue the conversation, you can find Septimus, Dan, and Martijn on LinkedIn. I'm sure they'd be happy to take the time to speak to you. SRM will be organising future webinars where we tackle some of these issues, so look out for that, and we'd love to see you again in the future. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.